Hello, we are Sophie Hirschelmann
and Renée Moreaux. We've been working on biosphere reserve development in different countries, like Georgia and Ethiopia, for Michael Succow Foundation.
And today we are presenting to you the topic of participation in UNESCO Biosphere reserves. Participation is a frequently used buzzword, and sometimes, as you may know, it's hard to know what people actually mean when they use it. So I collected a few definitions and descriptions which I found useful. I'm not going to read them all, you can stop the presentation and read through them. Just 2 or 3 examples. For example, Buhamrane says it's a transfer of decision-making powers to local resource users. Schliep and Steuer-Kleemann say it's a comprehensive involvement of all stakeholders in order to successfully turn biosphere reserves into model regions for human-environmental relations. Or the European Institute for Public Participation says it's a deliberative process by which interested or affected citizens, civil society organizations and government actors are involved in policymaking before a political decision is taken. This shows that there are different understandings which processes can be understood as participation, and there are also different ways of categorizing forms and levels of participation. Here we want to present 4 levels of participation which were defined by Mohidano, Roldan, Luit and Schulz. These are based on the ladder of participation of Sherry Arnstein, which describes a transition from being the bystanders of local area management to being part of the decision makers. And those 4 levels of participation are information, so it means that stakeholders are only informed and consulted about their activities. Second level is the implementation, which is the participation of local stakeholders in day-to-day management and monitoring efforts. Then there's involvement, the degree to which stakeholders take part in setting the goals for the biosphere reserve, for example, or representation, where local stakeholders are actually being represented in the biosphere reserve steering committee or board. The basic idea of all this is the higher the level of participation, the higher the level of compliance with the biosphere reserve. And now I want to shortly present what is written actually in the UNESCO MAB documents on participation. The Seville strategy, of course, mentions different articles on goals and objectives which mention participation. I'm not going to read through all of these articles. It's here for you to look at it in more detail if you like. It mentions that biosphere reserves should secure the support and involvement of local people. There should be involvement in planning and decision making. There should be a local consultative framework in which the stakeholders are represented, and so on and so forth. Also, the statutory framework of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, which is the international guidelines. And there, in Article 4, in the criteria for biosphere reserves, number 6, it says that organization arrangements should be provided for the involvement and participation of a suitable range of authorities, local communities, and private interests in the design and also in carrying out the functions of a biosphere reserve.
Now we would like to pose the question, why is broad participation of stakeholders and the civil society important? What are the goals of participation? First of all, it is important to reconcile nature conservation requirements, social needs, and economic demands by using the approach of community-based natural resource management as an overall framework. In this way, it is possible to foster the convergence of the long-term interests of all relevant involved stakeholders. Secondly, it is scientifically proven for BRs and protected areas in general that community involvement in the management is critically important for biodiversity protection and improve, of course, the conservation. It is not to be forgotten that conservation objectives in historical cultural landscapes may depend on the maintenance of human practices. As those ecosystems are shaped in this manner, some stakeholders have to be involved in the continuous management of the sites. For example, the sheep grazing on heathland. From the management perspective, it is even more efficient when stakeholders and community members are involved and empowered along all levels, which means from local to national, especially when it comes to solve critical management problems. It also creates higher legitimacy for the BR. The effectiveness of conservation activities can be increased through bottom-up processes, if communities feel ownership. Also, the expansion of the knowledge range, like a swarm intelligence of all involved inhabitants and stakeholders, provide the BR administration with better arguments, because decisions can be taken based on all available knowledge. On the second side of the slide, you can see that the acceptance of the population for the BR is another important goal, as well as a reason for participation. Because with increasing acceptance, inhabitants, stakeholders, and local government administrators will better support the implementation of activities of the BR administration, which strengthens cooperation activities and the local partnerships. People will be even more supportive if they take part in decision-making and receive benefits from conservation. For example, if funding programs are provided by the BR to establish new initiatives in a creative way. Transparent communication about decisions made by the BR administration is also critically important to increase legitimacy. Please keep in mind that acceptance comes always with local ownership for those decisions and people's identification with the BR. I would like to mention a scientific study from Stoll and Welp from 2008. They found out that 64% of 213 interviewed BR managers stated that community participation is relevant for increasing acceptance, which is important for the management success. Further relevant arguments for participation regarding equity and social justice are the fair distribution of rights and duties for resource use under consideration of the heterogeneity of the population and the different interest groups. Defining shared development objectives for sustainable resource use imply compromises between those who want to conserve the resources and those who live off them. Community-based natural resource management, as well as access and benefit sharing programs, strengthen trust, build capacities of stakeholders, empower marginalized groups, and lead to better recognition of their rights and responsibilities. From the ethical perspective, there is the intrinsic right of all inhabitants to participate in decisions affecting their livelihood and way of life. Another goal from the social point of view is the considering of traditional knowledge in management decisions. In this way, cultural identity can be maintained, and indigenous and local communities can be empowered as experts of unique knowledge. On top of that, community representatives can disseminate information and local knowledge amongst the community, which leads to better recognition and facilitation of activities.
I want to show one slide also on challenges and constraints in participation. So generally, of course, participatory processes are sensitive and complex processes which do not only show positive results. There are different problems and also frequent criticism, and I want to just raise some of the common aspects here. For example, there can be different power relations and different access to power, which can also include asymmetric power relationships. And, for example, there can be unwillingness to share power by those responsible for participatory management. This can be a problem. There can also be elite capture, so when processes are dominated, for example, by political or economic elites. There can also be intended or unintended internal and external exclusion of individuals or whole groups, which is problematic to proper participation. And this is also a criticism. Just like the lack of participation of certain disadvantaged groups, such as women or landless people, ethnic minorities. Then sometimes it is said that participatory processes can even support potentially simmering local conflict. And it is also criticized that participatory processes strengthen emotional instead of scientifically based decisions. It is criticized that there is a lack of democratic legitimacy in contrast to democratically elected decision makers. And also there can be an overload of the population, for example, due to limited capacity of stakeholders who participate voluntarily or in their free time. There can be tokenism, when the voices of participants will not really have any effect on the intervention and the participation does not lead to any change, so it's a pseudo-participation. There is a frequent problem, which is more easy to solve, that there's a lack of facilitation and clear objectives in some participatory processes. There is time and cost intensity as a general issue, which means that encouraging results may take a while to be developed and it needs patience. And there can thus be a lack of adequate resources and capacity building for a meaningful engagement. In our last part of the presentation, we want to look at good practices of participation in biosphere reserves, by which also some of these constraints and challenges which I just presented can also be overcome. At first, I want to mention some general principles. For example, an institutional framework that promotes participation is very central, very important, and should also go up to the level of involvement and representation of stakeholder groups. Then the involvement of all relevant stakeholders is important. There's a useful guideline. It says optimal, not maximal. So for some questions, as many community members as possible should be consulted. For other questions, work has to be done in smaller groups. So it needs a choice of the right stakeholders. And there are some useful guiding questions by the German Commission for UNESCO that can be used to decide on this choice of right stakeholders. It also means that different target groups require different forms of participation. So studies have found that, for example, for research users, it's most useful to participate in implementation matters, or it's most important to involve them there. And for example, for environmental administrators, it's most important to involve them in representation and information. Then it's important to pay attention to underrepresented groups, so they need special attention. And you should also check, for example, which needs there are by young people or by elderly people, which you need to consider when designing your participatory process. There should be a use of different knowledge and also different knowledge resources for joint regional learning, which should involve expert and local knowledge. Stakeholders need competencies for this, so you should provide methods and practices, but also training and capacity building in order to enable them to participate the way they should and want. Then you should provide open access to the best information, because access to knowledge actually supports the good decision making of the stakeholders. And of course, expert knowledge should be presented in an understandable way. All this leads to well-informed citizens that can take an active role in the participatory process, and this is what we want. Also helpful is a participation strategy that is site and situation specific and also adapted to the respective spatial and social context. For the specific design of processes, there are 3 helpful guidelines which I want to present. It's a common and clearly defined issue or question, clear goals, and also clear structure and rules of the process that are reasonable and also transparent for all from the beginning. Then there's a need for good communication, which means it should be transparent, understandable, target group specific, for example. And also it's necessary and helpful to have skilled facilitators and moderators that should be neutral, able to see and understand different positions equally. Here we also want to take a look at governance aspects that are relevant for successful participation. We can say that participation can be done well when the Biosphere Reserve administration acts as a coordinating and learning unit between organizations and sectors to initiate cooperation. PR administrations without strong regulatory role can act well as initiator, facilitator, advisor, or mediator. What is important is to consider local and traditional decision-making systems, and you should integrate their assets in the governance system of the BR that you are establishing or managing. Then, of course, it's important to make sure that women and minority groups are represented well also in the governance system of the Biosphere Reserve, and you should balance well the participatory approaches, the cultural decision-making, and the responsive management, which means that you should come up with a locally appropriate system that has representative processes, but also possibilities for communities to directly share concerns. For example, there can be established committees or thematic or geographic working groups. Then just a quick glimpse on the topic of governance models. The German Commission for UNESCO compares these two models in Biosphere Reserve management and governance. It's the NGO model and the authority model. You might know these two models already from the presentation of Thomas Schaaf on governance here on Biosphere Share. And we can say that the NGO model allows more involvement of local communities and also higher levels of participation. And recently this model has been also more promoted by the UNESCO. The Management Committee as a supreme decision-making body is composed of several different institutions and authorities. The management unit therefore has less formal and authoritative or executive power, but it can be active in several thematic areas and in all zones. It can act more like a platform to bring together diverse interests, and the communities can have a direct role in the supreme governance body. Interesting examples in this context is the Bad Henrike Biosphere Reserve Sweden, the Biosphere Reserve Bliesgau in Germany, and the Biosphere Reserve Lower Morava in Czech Republic.
All previously presented information on participatory management, target groups, information sharing, and governance also apply to the participatory establishment process, which I will describe in the following. In the beginning of the BR establishment process, several preconditions have to be considered. Most important is that the facilitated dialogue among all stakeholders, especially the resource users and municipalities, must start at a very early planning phase before any decisions are made, and that the whole process is open-ended. It also needs the support of a strong political will to implement participatory approaches and for having the BR in general. A disadvantage to create the idea about the BR as a bottom-up process, for example when a regional initiative wants to redefine itself, like in the Swabian Alp Biosphere Reserve. In this case, it was also beneficial having regional development projects in advance that made sustainability and conservation a subject of local discussions and prepared the population beforehand. A feasibility study on the potential of the area to become a BR, including high-level stakeholder engagement and authority agreements, is very needed. Depending on the context, awareness of harmful cultural practices among the BR initiatives is required in order to integrate a management of change with an inclusive and culturally sensitive approach instead. For example, in BRs in Tanzania. For this, I would like to refer the reference of Bell et al. 2013. The most important forms of participation in the establishment process are continuous information of everybody, the active involvement of all stakeholders in setting common goals for the BR, and their representation in decision-making institutions. It is recommended to use a holistic communication and bottom-up approach to foster social learning among stakeholders about multiple ways of resource use, the social ecological interdependencies, and cooperative interactions in the region. For example, the companion modeling approach from Matve et al. And Bomeran et al. They describe the following steps. Firstly, local initiatives may ask the National MAB Committee for support. Afterwards, public meetings for exchanging information about the MAB program and the world network of biosphere reserves in each municipality are needed. It is recommended to include a series of informal open meetings at inhabitants' homes or farms organized by volunteers. Afterwards, social meetings, official meetings with representatives of local stakeholders, environmental authorities, and municipality representatives to identify the territory and the main trends of development have to be taken place. Moreover, specific workshops with representatives for relevant topics like research, sustainable development, conservation, awareness raising, educational programs, and land use are to be organized. Special working sessions to specify the zoning of the proposed BR and the modalities of its governance are needed. A variety of different tools and methods are possible to include local, scientific, and traditional knowledge. For example, focus group discussions, semi-structured interviews, community mapping, historical matrices, institutional diagramming, and seasonal calendars. Additionally, I would like to give a specific methodological example. Rule games. They can put stakeholders as players in close to real situations. They are based on target group specific models for simulating multiple land use effects, and they can improve understanding and communication between different interest groups, like conservation, land use, and local economy. For more information, you can also refer to the study of Madvet et al. And Bumran et al. As mentioned above, the donation process needs special attention. In order not to alienate any interest group, possible scenarios for the future management of the BR should not be fixed in advance. Awareness among the BR initiatives is required about raising conflicts regarding the restrictions of core areas and land use, local property rights, and commercial interests. The agreement on the boundaries of the BR and the zones is driven by technical, ethical, and political consensus or compromises. It is important that the participatory mapping of culture, land use, and biodiversity is linked to the technical mapping of hydrology, ecosystems, and political boundaries. It may take several workshops and iterations with the different interest groups and target groups.
To end this presentation, we would like to cite the writer Margaret Wheatley with a quote that fits very well to the topic of our presentation today. And she said, "There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about."
Thank you very much for your attention. We wish you much success for your participatory projects. Feel free to contact us with questions or interesting experiences to share.